evening. Good to have you with us in this edition of the Urban Debate. Viewers, yesterday we spoke about social media and perils of it, how it's impacting all of us. Today we pick up another aspect of the perils of social media and the digital world. Tonight we speak yet again about the use and abuse of platforms like Facebook to try and brainwash citizens, to try and influence citizens, to try and push through certain propaganda, fake news, misinformation. And tonight we have another example that has emerged. BuzzFeed has in fact reported on this story where they have spoken about a whistleblower, a woman who worked with Facebook for over 3 years. She was a data scientist at Facebook, and she's penned down an exhaustive 6,600 pages memo. And in this memo, she says that she herself, during her time in Facebook, saw how governments, foreign governments, political parties used the platform, created fake accounts, brought in fake campaigns to try and influence voters and influence election. And that while she herself repeatedly took a lot of action to pull down such accounts, to shut them down, she herself is saying that often Facebook was either too slow or didn't take enough action. Now, in fact, in her revelations is a very interesting India link as well, where she says that during Delhi elections, which were held in February this year, she found about 1,000 actors who were involved in a coordinated campaign, and that Facebook never publicly acknowledged this network or publicly said that they had taken it down. But she had removed this network. Another indication that election after election, not just in US or in India or in Brazil, even in countries like Bolivia and Ecuador, institutions and political parties and establishments are using these social media tools. Now, our only effort is to tell you and inform you, the voter, you, the viewer. Only if you are aware will you be more careful about what you read and to what extent do you believe it. We also want to talk about what is the possible solution. Self-regulation. The social media giants say they're doing quite a bit. They're actively pulling down such kind of fake accounts and misinformation campaigns. But is that enough? Do we need government intervention? Can that be the solution when the allegation is that often it is the governments who are using these tools to mislead the people and the citizens? Then what possibly can be the way forward? Once again, that's the conversation tonight. Let me say good evening to the panelists who are joining us right now. Vivek Reddy, spokesperson for the BJP Karnataka. I also have Nikhil Pava back with us, editor for Media Nama, and Prasanna S., a lawyer with the Supreme Court. But first up, I actually want to go across to Craig Silverman, the media editor for BuzzFeed News. It's their story. Craig is one of the 3 writers who've put this story out. Craig, thanks for speaking to us here on Mirror Now. If you can just explain to our viewers essentially what is this whistleblower now saying?
Yes, thanks for having me on. So this whistleblower was, as you mentioned, a data scientist at Facebook for 3 years. And the team she was on was actually not really looking for political influence. They were just trying to get rid of fake accounts engaged in scam. But she came across repeatedly, even just her first 6 months on the job, she came across repeated examples of, in some cases, governments and heads of state being linked to networks of fake accounts that would, put fake likes on posts, that would troll and harass opposition figures through comments, that would help amplify, in some cases, disinformation or false information or propaganda. And so she, over time, found that she was finding more and more, but Facebook itself was not supporting her, was not following up on the work. And it actually came to the point where she ended up being fired because they kept telling her to stop focusing on this work, to go back to the spam-focused things, the non-political things. And she left the company within the last few weeks and, in fact, turned down a very lucrative severance package so that she could share this information internally at Facebook and say that the company is not paying attention to political interference that is taking place outside of Western Europe and outside of the United States.
Craig, in your conversation and in your assessment of what she's written, is it more about intentionally not giving this attention, or that the problem has become so giant and so grave right now across different countries that even the companies are struggling to crack down and to act in a fast enough pace?
I think it's a little bit of both. So what Sophie Zhang documents is, the company telling her that it simply didn't have the resources or the interest in following up on some of the things that she had found. And so I think there is a decision-making process at Facebook where it is putting more resources into the US, into Germany, into other countries, or when there's a big election going on. But outside of that, for smaller countries like Honduras, like Ecuador, Facebook is just not willing, it seems, to put the resources to investigate. Now, at the same time, I think you're right that this is such a widespread thing, and Facebook is in so many countries and has so many users that they are simply still, 4 years after saying they were going to take this stuff seriously, they still have not staffed up enough. They don't have enough people. They don't have enough specialized investigators, and they don't actually support people inside their organization who end up finding this stuff in countries that are not a priority at a given time. So some of this is absolutely as a result of its scale, but it's also making decisions about what it prioritizes, and it is not hiring enough people and not building enough systems to actually stop this stuff from taking hold in countries all around the world.
All right, I'll request you to stay on with us as part of this conversation, Craig. Let me also read out to our viewers what Facebook has to say after this story that BuzzFeed put out came out. Facebook says, we've built specialized teams working with leading experts to stop bad actors from abusing our system, resulting in the removal of more than 100 networks for coordinated inauthentic behavior. It's highly involved work that these teams do as their full-time remit. So they're essentially saying that they have special teams whose only job is actually to trace and track these kind of networks, organize attempts to try and influence people, put out a certain kind of narrative or propaganda, and they have pulled down over 100 of such networks. But Nikhil, what's your sense? Yet another example that's come to the fore. To what extent is it about social media companies not being able to keep up with the use and abuse of their platform, and to what extent are they not even committed to doing it?
Well, I think it's difficult for us to understand whether there's an intent to not deal with all of these issues. Tanvi, my point here is that Facebook claims that it has put substantial resources into regulating hate speech, into taking down hate speech on its side. But I think it's clearly not enough. The fact that this particular memo, which has been written about by BuzzFeed, specifically highlights that Facebook has had to choose to ignore certain aspects because there's just too much to do. It is horrifying. The fact that there is active, that some countries are deemed important, some countries are not. It just shows that Facebook just doesn't have the capacity. And that capacity is because it hasn't invested enough in addressing hate speech, political interference, and coordinated attacks, not just from a technology perspective, but also from a human perspective. Is Facebook profitable? It is. Has it invested enough into dealing with these issues? It clearly hasn't. So effectively, what it hasn't invested in increasing its capacity to deal with these issues has gone into profits. And I think it's about time that we started holding Facebook accountable for what it doesn't do, as well as for what it does. It has chosen not to take down hate speech, and it has, for example, apologized for Myanmar. It has, in India, clearly, when you look around Facebook, you see several groups with horrifying speech, polarization, targeting particular communities. These groups with hundreds of thousands of followers still remain up. And Facebook has only acted when it's been reported on it by the press. Yes, they may have acted on other occasions, but clearly what they're doing is not enough. Clearly, they need to build more capacity to do these things. And clearly, we need to regulate Facebook, especially in India, because it's such a significant company here. And those regulations need to ensure that we mandate certain requirements from the platforms to exercise, take down of content, especially when it comes to hate speech. As much as I don't want Facebook to play censor, I also realize that it is when they allow such content to stay up, it has an impact on society. It is this polarization that leads to mob lynchings and to an immense amount of violence against communities. And so we do need some amount of guardrails put in place through a regulation that targets large social networks and large platforms like Facebook, like Twitter.
Okay, so that's essentially, what I wanted to talk about again. There's as many times as I can, I will remind the viewers of this because, like we also pointed out yesterday, it's important for the people to know this. It's important for people to understand that even if Facebook tries all its might right now, they just haven't built enough systems in place to try and crack down on all of this. So there's a lot of misinformation. There could be a lot of, fake accounts, planned, coordinated attempts to try and mislead you, to try and influence you, and it's happening in country after country, big or small, doesn't matter. And this is for you to know so that next time you read something, you are able to make that informed, conscious decision and don't fall for anything or everything that you actually see on such social media platforms. Let me just actually then bring in Prasanna onto this conversation. Prasanna, what is the solution? Self-regulation. The companies keep saying they're doing a lot. They have these specialized teams, but obviously that's not enough. Is it really a place for the government to come in? If not, what's the solution?
Well, any solution that we propose are going to be fraught with some danger or another. The comments that I'm going to give now, I have to add this caveat and qualification that this applies only to India's constitutional context. In terms of regulatory options, the easiest one, the low-hanging fruit that we have is actually speech by the government and people who are connected to the government who exercise state power. When we are looking at regulating private actors, including Facebook, etc., there's always this problem of free speech, whether hate speech, where do you draw the line? We'll get into this kind of rigmarole every now and then, and there are not going to be easy answers. We're not going to find easy answers anytime soon, certainly not during this program. But one conversation that I want to begin is what can we do about government speech? Under India's constitution, it is only citizens that have a fundamental right to free speech. Government and people who hold constitutional offices, they do not. A lot of the problems of disinformation and hate speech having a viral effect on platforms like Facebook and Twitter is because several of these accounts receive legitimacy from the state. When you have people holding constitutional offices, for example, the Prime Minister or the Chief Minister of a particular state or union territory or the Minister of Corporate Affairs, etc., they run accounts. And the legitimacy and the credibility of those accounts are derived externally because they are state actors. But using those accounts, they still amplify content that amounts to misinformation or disinformation or hate speech, and that is how much of this content is amplified. I'm sure there is a significant part of it also because of influencers who've been propped up within the platform, but several of these are also related to accounts that derive their legitimacy and their credibility outside of the platform. And when that is derived from a context like the state, by virtue of holding a state office, it's certainly regulatable, legislatable under the constitution. There are no free speech problems there. We can easily pass a law that curbs on behavior or social media behavior of people who hold constitutional posts, statutory posts and the like. In fact, I would say even before pointing fingers at anybody, I mean, I must say I don't hold the brief for Facebook. I don't hold the brief for Twitter or any social media company. They're all for-profit corporations. Unless incentives are aligned correctly for them, they're not going to act. But what we can do is certainly demand answers of our government. They are answerable to us. We can certainly demand answers of our people, like our Prime Minister, our Chief Minister of the capital city, and other ministers as to what is their behavior on social media. And once they show that leadership, then we can start pointing fingers at other people and see how we can regulate them. But certainly, as I said, government has no fundamental right to free speech. It is easy to regulate government speech, and we must first regulate government speech. And that will significantly hurt the network of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech that many of these platforms build.
Okay, let me bring in Vivek Reddy. Then Vivek Reddy, what's your sense? Government intervention, government's own regulation first to begin with, as Prasanna puts it, or regulation of these portals?
Well, I think first of all, Tanvi, we have to look at the topography in which these big giants like Facebook and Twitter have come alive. They have come into a topography or an environment where they operate across international borders. So the big challenge for all governments around the world is how to regulate them internationally. And many of the fake news, much of the fake news, apart from its origin in a country like India, comes from outside India also, like the denigration of Indian gods, the humiliation to Indian mythology, the shaming of various gods across religions, happens from other countries where Facebook is active, and it is active in India also. So this kind of control against hate emanating from trans boundaries, I think this is an important area where regulation has to come at a broader international level, and they will have to fix accountability. And that is how we have to move forward. This is one area. The second is, I don't think I can agree with Prasanna when he says that the Prime Minister or a Chief Minister and their accounts being propagated by others, or they deriving their rights from, they are deriving their support from other accounts. I think this is all very, very, vague. And it doesn't answer the real challenge here. The real challenge here is there are independent bodies with fake news, independent accounts with fake news. They are trying to generate fake news, and they're trying to set up an attack on the system. So how do we stop it? How do we ensure that there is an ecosystem where these attacks, this hate, this sort of a fake news is removed from the system? I think, first of all, what emerges from this is who started it all. It is the Facebook company that started the company and allowed a uniform platform, a common platform for people to vent their voices. So how is it to be regulated by Facebook is something that we must look at. We must ensure that Facebook becomes accountable. It starts acting on these posts. And the best way to hold it accountable is to bring it within the laws of India, to file for defamation, to file for hate crime. I think it's time that we ensure that Facebook also becomes part of the criminal justice
point
system.
That is being made, Vivek Reddy, the point that is being made is yes. That, well, Facebook is not the one giving the hate speech or creating the fake news. Why don't we act yes. against those giving the hate speech or creating the fake news?
Yes, we should act. The laws of India are there, and they criminalize these actions, and we can take action under this, number one. But second thing is, at every point of time when we tend to bring in these criminal acts or bring in these criminal cases, that's when Facebook says, I am just a person who hosts this. I'm not a participant. Well, the real question is when Facebook is reminded or Twitter is reminded that, look here, this is a criminal act on your post. This is a criminal activity. This is defamatory, or this amounts to hate speech, or this crosses the border of free speech. Then they don't act also. They take days and months to act. That is where we have to criminalize them and make them accountable. Otherwise, the tendency of Facebook to be very lethargic in its accountability, of not reacting and being very indifferent to how it looks at these situations, will continue. Unless and until citizens themselves brings the host, who is the perpetrator who hosts this, who brings it out in his platform, I think they should also be brought within the ambit of criminal activity and they should be booked. What Prasanna says, that government does not have free speech. Well, the world over you find all the leaders of all the nations are also tweeting. Mr. Trump tweets. Mr. Every other world leader tweets. Well, that is their right. They also have that free speech. How can we say that they don't have free speech? I mean, they have every right to propound the fact they are not denuded of free speech under the Constitution. They are also equal players in the political system. They may be prime ministers, they may be leaders of nations. But yes, they have the right to vent grievances. They have right to express their voices. Their voices are not in any way less under the Constitution than the voice of an ordinary citizen. They are not denuded of this free speech. So that's where we find that we need to have a very critical system, a very structured system to attack fake news, particularly fake news, and to ensure that whatever transgresses the borders.
Yeah, but the problem is, Mr. Vivek Reddy, we've been talking about it forever, but election after election comes and goes and nothing seems to be happening. And, frankly, let me just say this. This is a large, a huge variety of challenges that we are facing right now. Let me narrow it down for the next, 10 minutes or so and specifically talk about the issue that's emerged now, which is political influence, which is trying to manipulate or influence people for political gains. Let's simply just talk about that fact, because that's one thing that nations across the world will have to grapple with when it comes to these to the digital era. Craig, very quickly, if I can ask you this question, has any country managed to figure out a solution to this problem when it comes to using of platforms like Facebook for political influence from US to elsewhere? Has anybody found a solution?
I mean, the very short answer is no. And that's because I think as we've listened to what everyone has had to say, it's a very complicated, interconnected issue. You have a variety of actors, whether it's politicians themselves, whether it's PR firms being hired at arm's length from politicians to spread and do this kind of stuff, whether it's motivated citizens who are maybe caught up in a political process, becoming, willing to do some things that cross the line. And so the legislation that we've seen, for example, in a lot of authoritarian countries, they've used it to criminalize free speech and criminalize opposition under the guise of stopping fake news. So it can go very wrong. We've seen Germany try and impose fines on the social media platforms if they don't remove violating content within a certain amount of time. That has worked in some ways, but also caused some things to be removed that shouldn't have been removed in others. So we have a complicated, interconnected issue. No country has come up with a perfect solution, and it's going to take a whole of society effort, not only with thinking about smart, focused legislation that doesn't have bad consequences, but also thinking about what kind of incentives we can use to force these companies to do a better job of managing their platforms. And also, as you have said, helping the public be good at distinguishing the information they see so that they are resilient and that they have the tools and skills themselves to navigate this very complicated media universe.
Okay, fair enough. That's a good point. And one thing that, two people on this panel have raised now, so let me talk a little bit more about that. Nikhil, is incentivizing the social media giants or disincentivizing them perhaps an option that we could look at?
Tanvi, first, let me just give a broader picture and, just so the viewers can understand what exactly the problem is. I don't think it's a challenge to regulate Facebook because Germany has done it using the NetzDG law. Currently in Australia, Google and Facebook are being regulated as well for links to news sites and articles. In India, Facebook is regulated by the IT Act, and there is nothing stopping us from bringing in a law that governs these social networks which operate in our country. So I don't think there's a problem with regulating Facebook. Number two is that we have to understand how Facebook operates. It is a platform that enables our free speech, and it's just as important to protect platforms that enable us our free speech as it is to protect speech itself. Because without these platforms, we would find it difficult to express ourselves, right? We wouldn't be allowed to. At the same time, while Facebook enjoys this freedom, they also have their own community standards as per which they take down content. Now, what we are seeing here is an erratic, is an arbitrary kind of a mechanism, sometimes allegedly biased way of dealing with content on the platform when Facebook is imposing its own community standards. What law can do, and just like Germany's done with the NetzDG law, where it requires Facebook to take down hate speech within a certain period of time, is that we can have laws that emphasize some of these guardrails, that when that they have to act on certain kinds of hate speech or on hate speech itself, and failing that they will face a fine. There can be instances where you can actually mandate what kind of community standards it should have for India in line with India's constitutional values. So it's not that we can't create a law to govern large platforms, and this can be specific to large platforms which also have a civic impact. But we have to be very careful when we're taking this approach, because we also don't want to give governments too much power over our speech. Remember, our fundamental rights protect us from the state. And so our rights to free speech have to be protected from the state controlling Facebook to actually start censoring legitimate speech. There are no easy answers here. There are going to be mistakes made. It's extremely complicated. But I do believe, given what we are seeing with Facebook's arbitrariness in dealing with speech on the platform and the harmful impact it has had, that it's time that we hold them to a higher threshold of accountability. And we look at means and methods to try and regulate how they control our speech as well, without impacting its role as a platform in enabling speech.
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, let me go a step ahead and say that, it may be, there's no easy answer to that. It may not even be an easy path, but it's highly important now, more than ever, that we start thinking on those lines and start figuring out what our possible solutions are. If I can, in fact, bring in Prasanna also on that one. Prasanna, like Nikhil said, easy to bring in a law and start regulating. There's already one existing when it comes to Facebook in India. Beyond that, what can be then? And again, I want to just right now talk about this very, very big dangerous aspect, which is that these platforms can be used to influence people during elections, politically influence them, mislead them, brainwash them. That is a very big challenge that we are staring at today.
It is. Just before coming to that broader point, may I just take a brief moment to respond to I had said about government speech and whether the free speech for state actors are denuded or not. So that I saying that my comments were only in India's constitutional context. In fact, in the US, there is a separate government speech doctrine where government is also held speech rights and all of that. And even there, when Donald Trump went ahead and blocked certain people from viewing his tweets, the courts had to step in and say he didn't have that right because as a state actor, he had a duty to be transparent to everyone, and therefore people had the right to view his tweets. So even there, they don't have a higher right. Where government speech doctrine is recognized, even there, the courts have been able to rein in Mr. Trump. Here we have a constitutional regime where we have only citizens having fundamental rights. Governments don't have fundamental rights. When somebody is acting in his official capacity, particularly if they've used their official posts, constitutional posts to get their accounts verified and thereby legitimized, all of that should be considered state speech and has to be controlled and contained as though they are constitutionally limited. On the second question of the larger issue of regulation during elections, etc. So your viewers, I may want to remind them. So under Article 324 of our Constitution, it is the Election Commission that is tasked with regulating everything that is connected with our elections. I'm sure there could be orders passed specifically to regulate social media content under powers under 324. In fact, prior to the 2019 elections, if you recall, the Election Commission had certain closed-door meetings with the heads of Facebook and Twitter, and we still don't know what transpired in that and what was the outcome. What is it that Facebook and Election Commission? I mean, I think we must demand answers of the Election Commission and have them come out clean and be transparent on what was it that transpired, and see if that is something, it's a model that we can follow going forward, or if there are any pitfalls in that. But unfortunately, we don't have transparency around that as well. But it's something that we must be asking of our Election Commission.
No, okay, so we have a bit of a network problem with you, but I largely got the point that you were trying to make. Let me put in a specific example. Now, this is not to say that a political party successfully managed to influence people in the Delhi election. We don't know who the party was. We don't know to what extent Facebook took action in taking down their accounts. But this is what the Facebook whistleblower, the ex-employee who's been fired now, has written down in a memo, and the specific reference to India is that she discovered there was an organized attempt with thousands of actors, during the Delhi election time. Now, the Delhi Assembly has a committee that they have set up, and this committee, as they call it, Peace and Harmony Committee, issued a notice to Facebook, and they have gathered their own evidence, notes. They have called in several journalists, experts, tech reporters on what's been going on, and they had asked specific questions to Facebook, to which Facebook has responded and saying, well, we are regulated by the IT Act, and we're already presenting ourselves in front of the parliamentary committee, so we will not be really giving you an answers. Then what do we do? Is it to say that only the parliament or the information and broadcast ministry is the one who can ask questions of Facebook? What happens to the case where we know perhaps something was attempted during Delhi elections and we won't get any clarity on that? Prasanna, would you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah. No, certainly, specifically on the question of the committee being set up, the Peace and Harmony Committee of the Delhi Assembly having been set up, it was following the Wall Street Journal story, where it was about not taking down hate speech of a certain character from the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party. So if in terms of hate speech, I mean, it would typically fall under the purview of Home Ministry, and all state governments and state assemblies will certainly be competent to take notice of it and seek answers from Facebook. Facebook cannot hide behind saying that under our federal regime, we'll only give answers to the central government or the parliament, and we will not give answers to state assemblies. I think that answer certainly does not carry any water.
Okay, Nikhil, do you want to come in on this aspect as well before I go across to Vivek Reddy on the specific issue of Delhi elections?
Yeah, Tanvi, I'm someone who had actually deposed before the Delhi Committee on Peace and Harmony. And my recommendations to the committee were that they should first and foremost ask Facebook to disclose the process documents regarding how they take down content, and also get information related to how the chain of command, who takes the decisions to take down content, because there have been allegations of interference in those decisions, right, by the local team. So until we have full transparency from Facebook, and in my recommendations on how Facebook should be regulated, transparency and accountability of community standards and processes is actually one of them. We need to know how Facebook operates, because what it allows to stay up and what it takes down can be politically motivated. I'm not saying it is, but it can be. And so therefore, we can't depend on the benevolence of these platforms to ensure that our democracies are not harmed. So we need to make sure that there's a regime of accountability in place, and that's what the Delhi government should ask for, the documents that haven't been made public.
Yeah. Briefly commenting on that, Tanvi. So this is not an easy question. For instance, if they want to, if we ask for disclosure of the algorithm, then we need to get into all intellectual property discussions and all of that as to algorithm, as to how hate speech is flagged and all of that. I'm not saying that these should not be regulated. It is just that we get into many more difficult problems. We already have many.
So just to respond, Prasanna, I'm
Okay,
not talking
Nikhil?
about regulating algorithms. There is a process in place that we don't know about. There is a chain of command of decision making where the local team might be involved that we don't know about. We need to know how these decisions were made by individuals, human in terms of human intervention, and what the chain of command is, and also the process that is followed by Facebook when taking down content or allowing it to stay up. We have no transparency on that right now.
Okay, in fact, isn't that something, Vivek Reddy, that the government itself, the center itself, must be asking the Facebook right now? And as our experts are saying, that is something that we can already do.
Well, I think that's the line that is taken. There is a parliamentary investigation that is open. And basically, it is the authorities under the IT Act which get the jurisdiction to start this. I mean, it just cannot start by some peace committee which has no authority under the Information Technology Act. We are as clear as that. And once the authorities start such a probe, can these issues come about? Can the processes be judged? Can the discrimination between the treatments be seen? I mean, when we say Facebook, we must also include Twitter and other big guys in the social media, because Twitter is also one person, which is one entity which is very partisan or biased in its filtering of the posts.
We don't
When
know that.
posts are objected to, well, I know that. We know that. Swami Agnivesh's post, Nikhil, Swami Agnivesh's post ridiculing Swami Agnivesh just about 2 or 3 days ago was removed in 24 hours, but a post ridiculing the mother goddess Kali was not been removed till now for 15, 20 days. So this is how Facebook, whatever you were pointing out, Nikhil, that the community standards of these entities, big entities, of these enterprises, Facebook and Twitter, are always questionable.
Correct.
What is their the basis on which they make these judgments? Is Agnivesh important or the sensitivities of Indians important?
Fair enough, Vivek Reddy. Since
look, arbitrariness
yes, almost everybody,
is not
irrespective of which side of the spectrum they are, left or right. Just 1 minute, Nikhil. I will come back to you. Almost everybody makes this allegation that they are arbitrary or they are biased against one or the other side. My question to you, very simply, Mr. Vivek Reddy, is this. It's been over 1.5 years since the first controversy regarding Cambridge Analytica and their role in elections exploded. At that point of time, Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad said, I'm going to call Mark Zuckerberg here and make him give us answers. Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad has written another letter in this month to Mark Zuckerberg again. Now, I am asking you, when we are repeatedly having these conversations, why are we not getting the answers when we are saying we need the answers? It's been 1.5 years. What answers have we got?
Well, the government is making this effort, but if you look at it world over, all the governments in the world are trying to, grapple with the situation. They're trying to rein in these the forces like Facebook and Twitter. They're trying to balance free speech with trying to eliminate hate speech, trying to eliminate fake news. It's become a big issue to actually guard free speech and to bring in those restrictions to free speech on a platform like Facebook and Twitter. So the process, the government is going through this process. If I remember, there was a committee also which was looking into how the rules can be framed under the IT Act and see as to how they could be reined in. I think that process has also gone to a certain stage under the IT ministry, and we have to see it shaping up into a proper format or a regulation.
Okay, Nikhil, you wanted to come in. Go ahead, please.
On the Peace and Harmony Committee, I think Vivek Reddy is wrong on that. All legislative bodies can have the powers to summon anybody to inquire into any matter, even if that matter does not fall into their particular lists. For example, they can always explore legislative options as to what they can do with what. So therefore, all of the legislative assemblies, all of the legislative bodies, state legislative bodies have the power to inquire into anything. Even now, when he says that only the IT Act, authorities under the IT Act have the power to inquire into anything, incorrect. That is not the law at all. Legislative assemblies are well within their power, well within their rights to inquire, summon Facebook if required. They can always explore legislative options. They can always explore options such as passing certain resolutions urging the central government to do something or the other. For that purpose, they can always have inquiries. So it is to say, delegitimize all of these legislative assembly hearings as though there's some kind of unconstitutional, anti-constitutional exercises are certain. It's certainly incorrect.
I think there is one thing Prasanna must realize, Tanvi. Yeah, there is one thing, with great respect to Prasanna, there is one thing that we must realize, that under our constitution, each of the legislatures have separate subjects under our list. So these are the constitutional limitations in a federal government. So we cannot jump these limitations. A state government cannot say, I will jump from my list, I will enter into the center list, I will start conducting investigation. Well, when you cannot pass a legislation on a certain subject, you cannot encroach or invade upon the center's power there, or the power of the parliament, and start supplanting your inquiry or substituting your inquiry. I mean, you're not a pseudo for that, or you're not a substitute for that. It is that body which is given those powers, embodied the constitutional sanctity, that has to be maintained. I mean, there is no law on that. It is very elementary. It is so elementary that you cannot jump lists. If you jump those lists, you are invading into the territory of another state, another legislature. This legislative encroachment by trying to conduct these inquiries is also an indirect harm against the constitutional structure. I think we must be very careful against such invasions before every peace committee in every state starts conducting investigations and all this ends up in chaos. I think we should prevent that.
Legislative
Well,
powers are
that debate about whether or not this committee...
Deliberative powers...
Yes, Prasanna.
Completely taken. Certainly, for example, even if there is a certain subject matter falling within an entry of a central list, a state assembly will be well within its rights, for example, to pass a resolution urging the center to act in a particular way or not act in a particular way. For example, in Tamil Nadu, Tamil Nadu had a resolution, for instance, on the issue of Elam.
Yeah, you cannot
even when foreign affairs and everything related to foreign affairs was a central list item. We've had
gentlemen, may I come in? I think this point of the legal point on whether or not the Delhi Assembly Committee has a legal standing here to summon Facebook and ask them a questions is a point perhaps that the Delhi government and the Assembly itself will be exploring now. And so let's just leave it at that. You've heard both sides of what our panelists had to say, because I'm running out of time. And so I'm going to thank my guests right now. But here is what I want to bring to the notice of our viewers again. Not just this whistleblower, who's written an exhaustive memo of how repeatedly governments, political parties across the world are using and misusing the Facebook platform, and the company isn't doing enough and not acting timely to bring this systematic effort down. Remember, viewers, a few weeks ago was the Wall Street Journal story that alleged that the Facebook's India top executive Anki Das was refusing to comply with the company's anti-hate speech rules when it came to specific politicians linked to the BJP. Not just that, let me give you more examples. In June 2020, Facebook fired an employee who protested against the inaction on Trump posts, and that person was fired. In August 2020, Facebook fired an employee who collected evidence of pro-conservative bias. This was another instance, again reported by BuzzFeed at that point of time. Again, in August 2020, Facebook employees internally questioned the policy after the India content controversy happened. So, internally, employees within Facebook also raised this issue, and that was also reported. Reiterating the point, there is more and more evidence now emerging that social media giants like Facebook are failing to crack down on fake news, misleading information, planned propaganda meant to influence views, opinions of citizens in our country, including around the time of elections. This is very, very dangerous. We need to ensure that these social media giants take some responsibility. We also need to ensure that governments actually go after those who put out these hate speeches, share this fake news. And we need to ensure that you and I understand that this is a possibility across the country. Only an aware viewer, user, voter will be able to make an informed decision. Thank you so much for joining us on this conversation.